My name is Winifred Brown Glaude. I'm an assistant professor of African American Studies at the College of New Jersey. And I just want to very quickly just join everyone in thanking Sandra Pouchet Paquet for all that she has done, not only for Caribbean literary studies, but even for folks like me, who's not a literary theorist. I'm trained in sociology, but she has had such a great impact on pushing me to think more broadly and more interdisciplinary, in a more interdisciplinary way. So I just want to thank Sandra for pushing me in that way. So very quickly, so the title of this round table is really the topic that we've been discussing in various ways all day, right? And that is the future of Caribbean studies. But we want to think not only of Caribbean literary studies, but Caribbean studies more broadly. So some of the questions that I want us to think about as we walk away from this panel today, from this symposium today, as we return to our various institutions, how are we imagining Caribbean studies? In what ways can we contribute to developing this field? What have been some of the more promising developments that we have observed over the last several years? And what do we imagine to be some of the potential challenges that we may encounter as we continue to build upon the solid foundations that Sandra Paquet, George Lamming, Anthony Bogues, and countless others have laid for us, right? So these are some of the questions that the panelists today have been asked to engage among themselves and with you. So as we know, Sandra Pouchet Paquet, is a professor emerita of English at the University of Miami and a major Caribbean advisor in Caribbean literary studies. She teaches, she taught in the field of Caribbean literature, African American literature, women's studies, and the author of many works, including the novels of George Lamming, Caribbean autobiography, and so on. Next to Professor Paquet is Patricia Saunders, Associate Professor of English at the University of Miami. Her research and scholarship focus largely on the relationship between sexual identity and national identity in Caribbean literature and popular culture. Then we'll have Stephen Stuempfle, the Executive Director of the Society for Ethnomusicology and adjunct associate professor in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology at Indiana University. Steve received a PhD in folklore from the University of Pennsylvania and has conducted field research in Trinidad, Texas, and Florida. And of course, last but certainly not least, is George Lamming, renowned writer, and he currently visiting professor and writer in residence at Brown University. Again, world-renowned intellectual, writer, critic, and educator. And we've been talking about a variety of his works today, including In the Castle of My Skin. And so, again, without delaying this any further, I just want to ask, again, each panelist, just very brief remarks, give us your initial thought about the future of Caribbean studies, and then we'll have a more extended conversation on this topic to follow. So let's begin with Dr. Pouchet.
Hi again. If we recognize the plurality of the Caribbean as place and people, I mean, to start there, the central question for me in Kamar Brathwaite's words is how to see the Caribbean whole. And it ought not to be that difficult, and it isn't that difficult if you draw a fairly contained circle and restrict yourself to what's going to fit in it. But as we are all keenly aware that in the last 50 to 60 years, not to mention the complexity of what went before, we have moved from, I would consider, a smattering of classic text to a field that is very hard to keep up with and continues to be rich and rewarding to investigate. To see the Caribbean whole, and I do not mean this quest to be read as a nationalist imperative, but the quest for overarching paradigms that would be inclusive rather than inclusive, and at the same time capture some signal feature or signal features of the literature that illuminate all. And I thought one way into this is probably introduce a case in point. And George Lamming brought it up earlier, the notion of the journey and migration as fundamental tropes, which may seem tired and worn, but they really aren't, because they renew themselves every generation with singular force, energy, and inventiveness. So we can leave it behind, like somebody said a long time ago, we're done with the Caliban theme. Aren't we? Are we tired of it? And you say, but have you read so-and-so? Apparently we're not done with it at all. So it's, this I find a very attractive facet of the writing as it continues. But this emphasis on journey and migration calls attention to the fact that the Caribbean world as we know it has not only been populated by the whole world, it opens out onto the world, the other direction. And this puts great stress, as I see it, on the point of origin as the Caribbean, because there is this outward flow of what is essentially purely, originally Caribbean in a variety of forms and languages. And, that cycle of migration, one scenario, one narrative speaks to return and renewal, but the other is a one-way street. It's, another place. And even with the return and the renewal, generationally one understands that there are limits to this. It's, it's not too far in the future in which you are reproducing Canadians and US citizens and UK citizens, Black British or what have you, you are not reproducing Caribbean. So it, in terms of mapping the literature, and the culture, and finding a way to talk about it as a whole, that in a way that is complex. And for me, the search for paradigms that will allow you to do this, so you could apply a kind of constraint on the subject. And I just thought of this as one example. And to give you another example of what I'm talking about, by way of the endurance, let's say, of a trope that is really an original trope that continues to serve the Caribbean art and criticism and production, I think rather extraordinarily well, that pays attention both to the shifting landscape and to the pattern that repeats itself, so that one can see continuity, one can impose a certain, coherence on the whole outflow of people and community. Is that I was just reading Edwidge Danticat's Great Dangerously, and I met with a reading group, and the first issue was the organization of the book, the shape of the book, how disorganized it was. Which Edwidge are we talking about? The eye keeps jumping around. What is the real theme of the book? What are we going to do with it? And I kept thinking, there isn't a criticism that is being raised here that doesn't apply to George Lamming's, or didn't apply to George Lamming's The Pleasures of Exile. That, on one level it almost seemed to me like she put down The Pleasures of Exile and say, I can write this from my point of view, in my place. And there's nothing outdated about The Pleasures of Exile. I was going to say updates it, but that's not the issue. It's a very necessary generational revisioning that has to happen if the literature is to stay current. Then we have to care about it and all of that. But I just wanted to, the elaborate self-positioning of the vulnerable observer, the very curious mixture of autobiography, and political statement, the self-authorizing process, the tracing of an intellectual tradition, a cultural tradition, a historical tradition, the link, all of it, self-placement, positioning. This is who I am. A process of naming, that is so extraordinary. And I'm stuck on coherent, and so coherent when it is looked at as a whole. I thought one of the rich things that we're going to be looking forward to is precisely the self-consciousness about the literary tradition. That is going to give us a whole new look, for instance, at something like The Pleasures of Exile, offer us another way to read it, and also see how intellectuals from previous generations continue to nourish subsequent generations. Anyway, that's the way I would just begin to respond to this very complex, wonderful theme. Sorry, that's it.
As we think about the present futures of Caribbean literary and cultural studies, I think of myself as someone, and I think Roseanne and several people have mentioned this throughout the course of the day, of the importance of culture or cultural studies in the role of thinking about literary studies. And although I think the popular discourse, the contemporary discourse around cultural studies is that it is emerging as there is in some way a waning of focus and emphasis on literary studies, I would beg to differ. Just in the context of the literary, in my reading of it, has always already been engaged with cultural studies. We've simply begun to call it by a different name, and that name has helped us to frame the methodology. So when we think, when I for one think about cultural studies, I think about the Birmingham School and the different ways in which Black British culture as well as Caribbean culture. I mean, when you look at a number of the Black British scholars, many of them are coming out of the Caribbean and thinking in very fundamentally complex ways about the dialogue that Caribbean literary studies has always already had with popular forms in Canada, in the United States, in the UK, be it calypso, be it painting, more recently, I would say carnival, dance hall culture, and most importantly, I think this is where Laura Cahill's work so richly influenced by Rex Nettleford's contribution to the discourse of movement, where the study of dance is also a kind, when you think about a novel like The Dragon Can't Dance, and the centrality of not only dance, but calypso music, costume making, ritual performance as part of this literary tradition. If we think about Kamal Brathwaite's limbo dance as another paradigm for thinking about migration, movement, and the shifting of boundaries, I think we do ourselves a disservice to imagine that in some way cultural studies is apart from literary studies. And so, and I think about myself, my role and my invitation here at the University of Miami in all the years of working with Sandra gave me a kind of ideal environment within which to tease out those problematics while simultaneously trying to insist that while we think about cultural studies as in dialogue with literary studies, that we appreciate and respect the conventions of cultural studies. That is to say that though we may be very strong and solid readers of literature, one cannot read film without a deep appreciation for film studies, film analysis, and film production, right? So that in the same way that there are literary conventions, there are also film-making conventions, there are also conventions of, in terms of the different disciplines.